And this is not surprising, but it's definitely out there as a countervailing force. Now, in the earlier period, I mentioned the Chester concession, so I won't go into that again. But there are other players involved too at the time. There was a U.S. High Commissioner in Istanbul at the time, 1919, 1920, Mark Bristol, who believed that the United States should not have a mandate for Armenia, should not even give aid to Armenia, and should instead have a mandate for all of Anatolia, because he believed this would aid American commercial interests in the new Turkey. So these strong economic interests, I think there's a very similar pattern here. And of course, I mentioned the oil interests back in the earlier period. For those of you who are familiar with Section 907 debate, this was instituted in 1992, which restricted U.S. government assistance to Azerbaijan because of its blockade of Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. The oil companies, of course, at the behest of the government of Azerbaijan, lobbied against this provision, and they really failed until the aftermath of 9/11. In the aftermath of 9/11, of course, it was the whole world turned upside down. Azerbaijan touted itself as a great U.S. ally, even though they had some mujahideen fighters on their soil and other sort of nefarious things going on. But nonetheless, they got on the good side of the U.S. administration, and in that sort of period after 9/11, they were able to get a presidential waiver to allow for direct U.S. assistance to Armenia. I will have to say that there's also an issue of in industry sort of taking part in the denial campaign. This is, I think, a rather sad chapter in American history, but nonetheless it's there that Turkey has put pressure on U.S. defense contractors and other businesses to actually participate in lobbying against Armenian genocide resolutions. And these lobbyists, they may not like it, but they're very willing to go along with it. And there's a similar thing where Admiral Chester, when he was trying to get his Chester oil concession, actually wrote an article in I think it was Current History of 1922. That's in kind of an academic political journal that's still around. In it, he completely whitewashed the whole Armenian genocide and said, people were moved to Syria where the climate was nicer and all kinds of stuff like that. So the denial was way back when, but unfortunately it also occurred much more recently. Let me just talk about the divisions in the community. Well, before I do so, let me just talk about one more similarity, then I'll talk about the divisions. The other similarity, which I alluded to, was the fact that many American politicians, of course, while they're out of office, say one thing, and then when they're in office, say another thing. And even though I'm a Democrat, it's not a partisan issue. I think Democrats and Republicans are equally guilty of engaging in this type of stuff. But we see that, of course, with George W. Bush during his presidential campaign of 2000, said one thing about the genocide, and of course, once he's been in office as president, has continually not used the G word. And of course, Charles Evans Hughes, as I said before, as Secretary of State, completely turned his back on the Armenians once he became Secretary of State. And a lot of other American politicians did the same. So of course, that's one of the big similarities. Let me just talk about the other similarity, which is, I think, the divisions within the community. As I said before, the Armenian National Union of America fell apart partly because of, or maybe largely because of, the divisions within the community. And there was also, of course, personality clashes. And of course, today, you have two Armenian lobbies, the Armenian Assembly of America and the Armenian National Committee. Now, some scholars, Heather Gregg, actually, in the journal Prisus of fall of 2001, she makes a comment about the two lobbies, two Armenian lobbies. She said, competition between these two lobby groups has led to hypermobilization of this ethnic group's resources. Their different approaches to lobbying have mobilized more Armenians and allies than one organization alone. The two lobbying groups have doubled outreach projects and resources on Armenian issues, magnifying the Armenian presence in the United States. So from her perspective as a scholar, she doesn't see this as a problem. She makes an interesting observation that you can mobilize both segments of the community. However, it does become a problem when the administration in power can play off one lobby against another. And this is a real danger, I think. Now, of course, the Armenian Assembly and the Armenian National Committee take oftentimes two different approaches to various issues. The Armenian National Committee oftentimes kind of goes for the jugular, where they'll bombard a congressional office with faxes, phone calls, and just try to sort of inundate them with either constituent mail or constituent messages. Whereas the Assembly oftentimes likes to play a role behind the scenes. Because the Assembly oftentimes comes across as more moderate, various administrations oftentimes like dealing with the Assembly versus the Armenian National Committee. Now, sometimes it's useful to play good cop, bad cop in the political context. And so sometimes it's actually beneficial to bombard a congressional office with faxes and phone calls. Other times, maybe the subtle approach is better. But nonetheless, it runs the risk of creating a situation where various members of Congress and also some members within the administration will favor one versus the other. And sometimes then it pits Armenians against each other. Now, Armenians always have an inclination to do that anyway, but when they have administrations sort of playing that game too, it sort of adds to the misery. So I just throw that out there as an observation. Finally, and I'll just end with this, there were actually also divisions within the Armenian community and the lobbying efforts back in 1918, 1927. Where because Kardashian was such a strong nationalist, he aligned himself with the ARF, the Deutschlandsution. So the ACIA was indirectly supported by the ARF at the time, whereas the Ramgavard and Reformed Hunchak parties drifted toward another organization which wasn't as powerful at the time, called the Armenian-American Society. So even back then, we saw differences in how the community sort of gravitated and had its own particular interests. So I guess the jury's still out on that. I said some scholars believe that the community divisions may not be a hindrance, it may be something that's beneficial, but just being in Washington, seeing how power politics is played, I really have my doubts about that. So anyway, thank you for your time, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have.